The airport buzzed with its usual early morning energy. Travelers moved with quiet purpose, wheeling suitcases and cradling steaming cups of coffee. Among them, Dr. Aaliyah Morgan and her 6-year-old daughter, Sophia, navigated the glossy tiles of the terminal. Aaliyah carried herself with the steady composure of someone accustomed to balancing responsibility and expectation. Sophia, clutching a well-loved stuffed giraffe named Mr. Spotty, skipped beside her, her braids bouncing with each step. Aaliyah glanced at her watch, a rare indulgence of time on her side. Their flight wasn't for another hour, and she allowed herself a small smile, savoring the quiet luxury of not having to rush. This trip wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was a reprieve, her first real break in months from the relentless rhythm of surgeries, meetings, and the demands of heading a busy neurosurgery department. "Mommy, can I have hot chocolate?" Sophia's small voice broke the quiet hum of Aaliyah's thoughts. She followed her daughter's gaze to the lounge's beverage station, where an attendant was arranging cups beside a carafe of steaming milk. "Of course, sweetie," Aaliyah said, kneeling slightly to smooth the hem of Sophia's sweater. "Just be careful not to spill it on your travel outfit. Okay?" Sophia nodded solemnly, the weight of this responsibility evident on her tiny face, as the little girl carefully carried her cup back to their seats. Aaliyah felt the usual tug of mixed emotions. Her daughter's joy reminded her why she worked so hard to give Sophia opportunities she herself had rarely glimpsed growing up. But the looks were always there, faint shadows in the periphery. Seated now, Aaliyah caught her reflection in the lounge's glass windows. Her tailored navy blazer, crisp white blouse, and neat twists spoke of someone who belonged. Yet, even after years of proving herself, the glances lingered. A businessman walked by, his gaze flicking from her to Sophia with a faint narrowing of the eyes. A small family nearby exchanged quiet words while glancing their way. She had long since learned to read these moments, not with anger but with the resigned acceptance of someone for whom they had become part of life's background noise. Her phone vibrated with an email notification, but Aaliyah ignored it. Today wasn't for responding to residents' questions or reviewing departmental budgets. Today was for her daughter. She reached over, steady surgeon's hands helping Sophia situate her giraffe so it wouldn't tumble from the armrest. Sophia looked up with a chocolate mustache, grinning proudly. "They put marshmallows in it," the little girl declared, drawing amused glances from nearby passengers. Aaliyah chuckled softly. "Well, don't let Mr. Spotty steal them." The moment felt simple, mundane even, but it carried a weight that few could see. It wasn't just hot chocolate or a stuffed giraffe. It was a quiet act of defiance against the subtle expectations that had trailed Aaliyah her entire life. A single black mother, a neurosurgeon, a first-class ticket holder. The complexity of who she was often seemed too much for strangers to reconcile in the brief moments they encountered her. And so, assumptions filled the gaps. "Mommy, how long until we see Grandma?" Sophia asked, her voice pulling Aaliyah back to the present. "Not long, baby," she replied. "We'll be at her house in time for dinner. She's making your favorite mac and cheese." Sophia's face lit up. "With breadcrumbs?" Aaliyah nodded, unable to suppress a smile at her daughter's enthusiasm. The joy was infectious, even as Aaliyah braced herself for the subtle challenges ahead. The flight, the inevitable small talk, the casual assumptions. When the announcement for first-class boarding came, Aaliyah guided Sophia toward the gate. Hand in hand, they walked down the jet bridge, Sophia's chatter filling the air. Questions about planes, clouds, and everything in between tumbled out of the little girl's mouth, and Aaliyah answered each one with practiced patience. Her heart swelled with pride watching Sophia's curiosity. She wanted her daughter to believe the world was limitless if only for a little while. The cabin was quiet, its leather seats and spacious aisles offering a temporary reprieve from the crowded terminal. Sophia's eyes widened at the large window beside their seats, and she climbed in eagerly, settling Mr. Spotty on her lap. Aaliyah helped her buckle in, then placed their bags in the overhead compartment. She caught the brief glance of a man in a suit seated a few rows behind, his eyebrows lifting as he looked at them. Another moment, another assumption. She let it pass without acknowledgement. "Apple juice for the little lady?" The flight attendant, A cheerful woman in her early 40s appeared with a tray. Yes, please, Sophia said, her small hands accepting the glass with the same care she had shown her hot chocolate. And for you, ma'am? Water's fine, Aaliyah replied, smiling politely. She adjusted Sophia's headphones, ensuring the tablet screen displayed her favorite puzzle game. As Sophia leaned into her seat, engrossed in the colorful shapes, Aaliyah allowed herself to exhale. For a moment, there was peace, a brief pause in the delicate balancing act of her life. The plane began its taxi to the runway, the low hum of the engines filling the cabin. Sophia reached for Aaliyah's hand, her usual takeoff nerves showing. Aaliyah squeezed it gently, grounding them both in the simple connection. This was what mattered, not the glances, not the assumptions, just her daughter. Her hope for a better future. As the plane lifted into the sky, Aaliyah glanced out the window at the sprawling clouds below. From this height, the smallness of the world was striking. The petty judgments and silent prejudices seemed distant, insignificant against the vastness of the horizon. Yet she knew their weight all too well. They were always there, shaping the air in ways that often went unnoticed but never unfelt. Sophia giggled beside her, pointing at a cloud shaped like a dragon. Aaliyah smiled, her heart settling. The journey ahead was more than miles and minutes. It was about carving space in a world that wasn't always ready to make room. But for now, as the sun poured through the cabin window, all that mattered was this moment, a mother and her daughter, climbing above the clouds. The hum of the engines provided a steady backdrop as the plane reached cruising altitude. Aaliyah adjusted Sophia's blanket, her fingers smoothing the soft fabric over her daughter's lap. Sophia had fallen into a peaceful rhythm, her small hands expertly swiping at the puzzle game on her tablet. The cabin had settled too, with passengers absorbed in their own routines, books, laptops, and the occasional muted conversation. Aaliyah leaned back in her seat, letting her body sink into the leather. The past few weeks had been relentless, the kind of pace that left her stealing rest in fleeting moments like this. She glanced out the window at the endless sky, her thoughts wandering to the week ahead. Quiet time at her mother's house. Dinners around the table, the garden Sophia had been eager to help plant. The interruption came gently at first, a shadow passing over her peripheral vision. She turned slightly, meeting the curious gaze of a man seated across the aisle. He appeared to be in his early 60s, with neatly combed silver hair and a tailored suit that suggested a lifetime of boardrooms and decision-making. He smiled, the kind of practiced warmth that hinted at a man used to conversation on his terms. "I couldn't help but notice how well you manage her," he said, gesturing toward Sophia, who was now humming softly to herself. "It's rare to see a child so well behaved on a flight. You must be very experienced." Aaliyah returned the smile, polite but measured. "Thank you, she's a good traveler." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a more familiar tone. "I imagine it's not easy, traveling with someone else's child. Families must appreciate having someone like you to help." The words hung in the air, gentle yet heavy, like a weight that Aaliyah recognized all too well. She took a slow breath, the way she often did before answering a complex question in the operating room. She glanced at Sophia, oblivious to the exchange, her world filled with colorful shapes and cheerful sounds. The man's expression didn't falter, his eyes searching for confirmation of an assumption he believed harmless. Around them, the quiet hum of the cabin seemed amplified, as if the space itself were waiting to see how this moment would unfold. A few passengers nearby had paused their activities, their movements imperceptibly slower as they listened without appearing to. Aaliyah sat straighter, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. "Actually," she began, her voice calm but deliberate, "Sophia isn't someone else's child. She's my daughter." The man's smile faltered for the briefest moment, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by an awkward laugh. "Ah, of course. My mistake. I suppose I didn't expect." His voice trailed off, leaving the unspoken words hanging between them. The silence stretched, filling the space with a quiet tension that no one seemed willing to acknowledge. Aaliyah noticed the flight attendant nearby, her hands pausing over the tray of drinks she was arranging. Her gaze flickered toward them, subtle but watchful. It happens more often than you might think. Aaliyah said gently, her tone devoid of accusation. She adjusted Sophia's blanket again. A small gesture that spoke more of her calm than her words did. Assumptions. I mean. The man shifted in his seat, his fingers lightly drumming the armrest. Well, I didn't mean anything by it, he said, his voice quickening. You carry yourself so professionally. I thought perhaps you were a caregiver or a nanny. His words were meant to smooth over the moment, but they only deepened the quiet undercurrent of discomfort. Aaliyah met his gaze, her expression thoughtful rather than confrontational. I am a caregiver, she said simply. I care for my daughter. And professionally, I care for my patients. I'm a neurosurgeon. The man blinked, the word hanging in the air like an unexpected gust of wind. A neurosurgeon? He repeated, his tone now tinged with disbelief. Yes, Aaliyah replied, her voice steady. Chief of neurosurgery. Actually, at Boston General, this trip is the first real vacation I've had in months. The man's expression shifted again, a blend of embarrassment and self-awareness settling into the lines of his face. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. The cabin, though still filled with the low hum of the engines, seemed to quiet even further. Nearby passengers had stopped pretending not to listen. I see, he finally said, his voice quieter now. That's impressive. Aaliyah gave him a small, gracious nod. Thank you, but you know, she added after a pause. It's not the first time someone's made that assumption about me. And I imagine it won't be the last. The man looked down, fiddling with the cuff of his sleeve. I suppose we all have our blind spots, he said after a moment. I didn't mean to offend you. I'm not offended, Aaliyah replied, her tone soft but firm. But it's worth thinking about how those blind spots affect the way we see the world. And each other. Her words were calm, almost conversational, yet they carried a weight that rippled through the small space around them. The man nodded slowly, his gaze distant as if reflecting on something deeper. The flight attendant resumed her movements, her expression subtly approving as she handed Aaliyah a glass of water. Sophia stirred, looking up at her mother with sleepy eyes. Mommy, can I show Mr. Spotty the clouds? She asked, her voice cutting through the tension with the unfiltered innocence of a child. Of course, sweetheart, Aaliyah said, helping Sophia shift closer to the window. She smoothed her daughter's hair, her hands steady as ever, and watched as Sophia pointed out shapes in the clouds to her stuffed giraffe. Across the aisle, the man remained silent, his posture more subdued. Aaliyah returned her attention to her daughter, letting the moment settle like the plane itself. Steady against the wind, the unspoken truths of the exchange lingered, subtle but undeniable, much like the clouds outside, always present, always shifting, yet ever a part of the sky. The cabin had settled into a comfortable stillness, the sort of quiet that follows the initial buzz of takeoff. Some passengers were reading, others typing away on laptops or leaning back with their eyes closed. The steady hum of the engines a soothing constant. Yet, for those who had overheard the earlier exchange, a subtle energy lingered, a collective awareness of the unspoken truths that had briefly surfaced. Aaliyah focused on Sophia, who was now deeply engrossed in her puzzle game. The little girl's fingers darted across the screen, her whispered commentary on the game's progress filling the space between them. It was a grounding moment, a reminder of the simplicity and purity that children carry, unaware of the complexities swirling around them. Across the aisle, the man Richard, she had learned from the airline tag clipped to his briefcase, sat with his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He wasn't looking at her now, his gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the window. There was a stillness to his posture, a visible weight in the way his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. It was the look of someone replaying a moment, grappling with its implications. A flight attendant passed through the aisle, her tray of drinks balanced expertly. When she reached Richard, she paused. Would you like anything else, sir? She asked, her voice light yet professional. Richard shook his head, murmuring a quiet, no. Thank you. His attention didn't waver from the view outside, though the faint flush on his face suggested he was still acutely aware of the earlier interaction. The minutes ticked by, the cabin settling further into its quiet routine. Then, as if breaking the spell, Richard shifted in his seat and turned to face Aaliyah. His expression was tentative, his earlier confidence replaced by something softer. Almost hesitant. "Dr. Morgan," he began, his voice low, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier. About assumptions." Aaliyah looked up from Sophia, her expression neutral but attentive. "Yes? I'd like to apologize," he said, his words deliberate, as though he'd rehearsed them in his mind. "For what I said earlier. I wasn't thinking. And, I realize now how it must have sounded." There was a sincerity in his tone that softened the moment. And Aaliyah nodded gently. "Thank you," she said simply, letting the weight of her calm acknowledgement carry more than the words themselves. Richard seemed to relax slightly, though his discomfort lingered. "The truth is," he continued, "I've spent my career consulting with companies about leadership and inclusion. I talk about recognizing biases all the time. Yet here I am, proving I still have so much to learn." Aaliyah tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "Recognizing a bias is the first step," she said evenly. "It's what we do afterward that matters." Her words seemed to land heavily. And Richard nodded, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. "It's humbling," he admitted. "I have 3 daughters. You know, strong, capable women, and I'd hate for someone to look at them and see less than what they are because of their own assumptions." The sentiment struck a chord. A subtle but genuine crack in the wall of his earlier self-assurance. Aaliyah let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing him the space to reflect before she spoke again. "Assumptions are a part of human nature," she said, her tone measured. "We all carry them, shaped by our experiences, our environments. But unchecked, they can cause harm even when that harm isn't intentional." Richard nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "You've clearly had to deal with more than your fair share of them," he said, his voice tinged with regret. Aaliyah's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You could say that," she replied, "but it's also given me opportunities to educate, to show people what they might not have seen otherwise." Across the aisle, a young woman who had been pretending to read her book finally spoke up. Her voice tentative but clear. "If you don't mind me saying, Dr. Morgan, the way you handled that earlier, it was remarkable." Aaliyah glanced at her, surprised but appreciative. "Thank you," she said. "It's not always easy, but I've found that anger rarely changes minds. Patience and understanding, on the other hand, they go a long way." The woman nodded, her cheeks coloring slightly. "I'm a first-year medical student," she admitted. "Seeing someone like you, someone who's achieved so much and handles moments like these with such grace, it's inspiring." Aaliyah felt a flicker of warmth at the young woman's words. "I appreciate that," she said, "and if I could offer any advice, it's to hold on to that patience. You'll need it, both in medicine and in life." The conversation seemed to ripple outward. A man seated a row ahead turned slightly, nodding toward Aaliyah. "My daughter's considering medical school," he said. "She'd benefit from hearing your story." "We all would." Even Richard seemed bolstered by the shift in tone. "If you're willing," he said, addressing Aaliyah directly, "I'd like to share this experience in one of my seminars. Not as a lecture, but as an example of how we can learn even when we think we already know." Aaliyah regarded him thoughtfully. "If it helps someone else see things differently," she said, "then I'd be glad for you to share it." Richard's expression softened into a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I think it will." Sophia stirred beside her, tugging lightly at Aaliyah's sleeve. "Mommy," she said, her voice filled with innocent curiosity. "Why are they all talking to you now?" Aaliyah leaned down, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "Because sometimes," she said gently, "people learn things they didn't know before." Sophia nodded, seemingly satisfied, and returned to her game. Aaliyah looked back at Richard, who met her gaze with a newfound respect. The moment felt lighter now, the earlier tension replaced by a shared understanding that, while imperfect, held the promise of growth. The plane continued its steady path through the sky, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. For the first time in a long time, Aaliyah felt a quiet hope not just for herself, but for the conversations yet to come. The plane cruised steadily above the clouds, its engines humming a soothing monotone. Aaliyah sat quietly, watching Sophia, who had now abandoned her puzzle game in favor of looking out the window. Her small hand pressed against the glass, tracing imaginary shapes in the clouds. Her giggles muffled but infectious. Aaliyah adjusted her daughter's blanket, her movements instinctive and deliberate, the subtle rhythm of motherhood. Across the aisle, Richard glanced over, his expression softer than it had been earlier. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then leaned slightly toward her. "Dr. Morgan," he began, his tone quieter now, almost reflective. "Do you mind if I ask how did you get into neurosurgery? It's not exactly a common path." Aaliyah turned to face him fully, her posture relaxed but composed. "It wasn't a straightforward journey," she said, her voice measured, as though recounting a case history. "I've always had a fascination with how the brain works, how something so complex can control everything about who we are. But pursuing neurosurgery," she paused, her eyes briefly drifting to the horizon outside. "Let's just say there weren't many people who thought someone like me could do it." Richard frowned slightly, the weight of her words settling between them. "Someone like you?" he repeated, though the question was more rhetorical than anything else. Aaliyah nodded. "A young black woman from a small-town public school. There weren't exactly a lot of role models for me to look up to in this field. But I had a mother who taught me to push through the noise. To focus on what I wanted, not what others expected of me." Nearby, the young medical student who had spoken earlier shifted in her seat. Her interest evident. She didn't speak, but her eyes were fixed on Aaliyah, her book forgotten on her lap. Other passengers, too, had begun to pay closer attention, their movements slower, more deliberate, as if not wanting to interrupt. "And did you always know this is what you wanted to do?" Richard asked. Aaliyah's lips curved into a faint smile. "Not always," she admitted. "There were moments of doubt, times when the barriers felt insurmountable. But the first time I assisted in a surgery, saw a child wake up after a procedure that saved their life, there was no going back after that. I knew I'd found my purpose." The medical student finally spoke, her voice tentative. "Did you face a lot of resistance during your training?" Aaliyah turned to her, her expression both kind and thoughtful. "Resistance? Yes. Subtle, most of the time. Professors questioning my decisions more than my peers. Patients who asked for a second opinion before I'd even finished introducing myself. But over time, you learn to let the results speak for themselves." The student nodded slowly, her admiration clear. "That must have been hard." "It was," Aaliyah agreed. "But it also taught me resilience. And the importance of showing up not just for myself, but for those coming after me. Like you," she added, her gaze steady on the young woman. "You're part of the next generation. The one that will make it easier for the ones who follow." The student's face lit up, a mix of gratitude and determination. "Thank you," she said quietly. Richard shifted again, his fingers grazing the edge of his tray table. "I have to admit," he said, his voice almost apologetic, "I've never really thought about what it takes to break into a field like yours, what it must feel like to carry those expectations while navigating all the, well, assumptions." Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, acknowledging his honesty. "It's not something most people think about until they see it up close," she said. "And that's part of the problem. When you're the only one in the room who looks like you, it can feel like you're carrying more than just your own ambitions. You're carrying the weight of proving everyone else wrong." Richard's brow furrowed as he absorbed her words. "That's a heavy burden," he said softly. "It is," Aaliyah agreed. "But it's also a privilege. Because every time someone sees me walk into that operating room, every time a little girl looks at me and thinks, I can do that too, it makes the wait worth it." From a few rows ahead, the man who had mentioned his daughter earlier turned back to join the conversation. "My youngest is in college now," he said, his voice warm with pride. "She's studying engineering, and I know she's faced her share of challenges too. Hearing your story, it reminds me of what she's up against. And how important it is for people like her to see someone like you." Aaliyah nodded, her expression softening. "Representation matters," she said, "not just in the obvious ways, but in the quiet ones too. It's about normalizing what should already be normal." The conversation flowed naturally now, like a stream winding its way through a quiet forest. Passengers who had been silent began to contribute their own reflections, stories of daughters, nieces, and friends who had faced similar struggles, and their own realizations of how they might have unconsciously added to the barriers. The flight attendant paused nearby, her tray now empty, but her attention fixed on the growing dialogue. "I don't mean to interrupt," she said softly, "but I just wanted to say, I've seen moments like this before. And it's not often they turn into something positive. The way you've handled this, Dr. Morgan, it's made an impression on more people than you realize." Aaliyah offered her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, but I think we all have a part to play in these moments." The attendant nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We do," she said, before moving on down the aisle. Sophia, who had been quietly playing, suddenly looked up and tugged on Aaliyah's sleeve. "Mommy, is everyone talking to you because you're a doctor?" Aaliyah chuckled softly, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "Maybe," she said, her tone light but affectionate. "Or maybe it's because sometimes people just need a little help seeing things differently." Sophia nodded, satisfied, and returned to her game. Aaliyah glanced around the cabin, taking in the faces of the passengers who had joined the conversation, each one carrying a story, a perspective, a realization. The moment felt quiet but profound, a ripple of understanding spreading through the small space they shared. Outside the window, the horizon stretched endlessly ahead, a reminder of both how far they had come and how much further there was to go. For now, though, Aaliyah allowed herself to feel a quiet sense of hope, one conversation at a time. The world could change even at 35,000 feet above the ground. The flight drifted into a quiet rhythm, the kind that comes when people settle into their routines. The hum of the engines provided a backdrop to murmured conversations, the rustle of newspapers, and the occasional clink of a glass being set down. Outside, the clouds seemed endless, stretching in soft waves below the plane, a world unto themselves. Aaliyah sat in her seat, watching Sophia, who had fallen asleep mid-sentence, her stuffed giraffe tucked securely under one arm. The little girl's breathing was soft and steady, her curls resting against the seat back. Aaliyah adjusted the blanket over her daughter, her movements automatic, her focus divided between the present moment and the lingering reflections of the conversation with Richard. Across the aisle, Richard was quiet, his expression thoughtful. He glanced over now and then, as if weighing whether to speak again. Finally, he leaned forward slightly, his voice low to avoid disturbing Sophia. "Dr. Morgan," he began hesitantly, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said earlier, about assumptions and the weight they carry." Aaliyah turned her attention to him, her expression calm but open. "Go on," she encouraged. He sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "I realized something during our conversation. For most of my life, I've prided myself on being open-minded, progressive even. I raised my daughters to believe they could do anything. But when I look at myself, I see how often I've relied on my own assumptions about people. Assumptions I didn't even know I was making." His admission hung in the air between them, honest and unguarded. Aaliyah studied him for a moment before replying. "Awareness is a powerful first step," she said softly. "It's not easy to confront the ways we've fallen short, especially when we didn't mean to. But it's also where change begins." Richard nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. "You know, I've built a career advising companies on leadership and inclusion. I talk about recognizing unconscious bias all the time. But now, after this, I'm starting to see just how much I've missed." There was no self-pity in his voice, only a quiet humility that felt genuine. Aaliyah allowed the silence to stretch for a moment before responding. "Biases aren't always loud or obvious," she said. "Sometimes, they're as subtle as a glance, a hesitation, or a question that assumes more than it asks. But those small moments when repeated can leave lasting marks." Richard looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't want to be the kind of person who adds to those marks," he said. "Not for my daughters. Not for anyone." Aaliyah nodded, her expression softening. "Then don't," she said simply. "Recognize the moments when you falter. Learn from them. And when you're in a position to change how others see the world, use it." The conversation seemed to ripple outward again, A few rows ahead, a woman turned slightly in her seat. Her gaze thoughtful. She had been quiet until now. But her voice carried a quiet confidence when she finally spoke. "It's something I've been thinking about too," she said. "I work in education, and I see how early these assumptions start. A teacher who calls on boys more often than girls in math class. A parent who discourages a child from pursuing their dream because it doesn't fit." She paused. Her expression clouded. "It's subtle, but it adds up." Another passenger, an older man with a neatly trimmed beard, nodded. "I've seen it in my own family," he said. "My granddaughter is brilliant, top of her class in physics. But when she talks about applying to grad school, there's always someone who asks if she'll have time for a family. They wouldn't ask that if she were a man." The flight attendant paused nearby, listening quietly as she refilled a glass. When she spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "It happens in my job too," she said. "People assuming I'm not educated or that this is the only thing I could do. But the truth is, I chose this work because I enjoy it. That doesn't make me any less capable." Aaliyah glanced around, taking in the faces of those who had joined the conversation. What had begun as a single exchange had grown into something larger, a shared reflection on the invisible threads of bias that wove through their lives. Sophia stirred in her sleep, mumbling softly. Aaliyah adjusted the blanket again. Her touch gentle. She looked up to find Richard watching her, his expression thoughtful. "Your daughter," he said after a moment. "She's lucky to have you as her role model." Aaliyah smiled faintly. "She's the one who inspires me," she replied. "Every day, I look at her and think about the world I want her to grow up in. A world where she doesn't have to prove her worth before it's recognized." Richard nodded, his gaze drifting to the window. "We all have a part to play in making that world," he said quietly. "I see that now." The plane hit a small pocket of turbulence, jostling the cabin slightly. Conversations paused as passengers steadied their drinks and adjusted their seats. When the moment passed, the dialogue resumed, quieter but no less meaningful. "I'll be honest," Richard said, his voice thoughtful. "When I came on this flight, I didn't expect to leave with such a shift in perspective. But you've given me a lot to think about, Dr. Morgan, and for that, I'm grateful." Aaliyah met his gaze, her expression steady. "Change doesn't happen all at once," she said, "but every small step matters. Even this conversation, it's a start." As the cabin settled into a reflective quiet, Aaliyah glanced at Sophia once more. The little girl's face was peaceful, untroubled by the complexities of the world around her. Aaliyah knew that wouldn't always be the case. But for now, she held on to the hope that moments like these, quiet, honest, and filled with intention, could shape a future where her daughter's path was just a little easier. Outside, the clouds stretched on, a vast expanse of white and blue. Somewhere ahead, the horizon blurred into the promise of something new. The plane drifted onward, high above the invisible lines dividing land and sky. Inside the cabin, a soft quiet had settled. Passengers, once preoccupied with their own worlds, now seemed to move with a quiet awareness of one another. The earlier conversations, though subdued, had shifted something in the atmosphere. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic moment, just the subtle, unspoken realization that perspectives had shifted. Aaliyah leaned back in her seat, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Sophia was still asleep beside her, her face turned toward the window, where the sunlight bathed her small features in a warm glow. The steady rise and fall of her daughter's breathing was a comforting rhythm, grounding Aaliyah in the simplicity of the moment. Across the aisle, Richard sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees. His earlier tension had faded, replaced by an introspective calm. Every now and then, he glanced toward Aaliyah, as though still piecing together the weight of their earlier exchange. It wasn't guilt that lingered in his expression, but something quieter, more reflective, a sense of wanting to do better. "Dr. Morgan," he said softly, breaking the silence. His tone was steady, respectful, as if he had measured his words carefully before speaking. "Do you think it ever really changes? The way people see each other?" "I mean," Aaliyah turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Change is slow," she said, her voice calm but certain, "and often uncomfortable, but it happens sometimes in ways we don't see until we look back." Richard nodded, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. It's hard, though, isn't it, to undo what's been taught? Even when we think we're doing better. It is, Aaliyah agreed. But it's also necessary, because the alternative is staying the same, and that's not good enough. Their conversation caught the attention of a woman seated a row ahead, who turned slightly in her seat. She appeared to be in her 70s. Her silver hair pinned neatly back. I've seen changes in my lifetime, she said, her voice quiet but firm. When I was a girl, there were places I wasn't allowed to go because of the color of my skin. Now, my granddaughter is a lawyer. That's change. But, she paused, her gaze shifting to Aaliyah. It doesn't erase the things people still carry in their hearts. Does it? No, Aaliyah said, her tone reflective. It doesn't, but each generation carries the opportunity to teach the next, to show them a different way. The woman nodded, her expression softening. I suppose you're right, she said. We don't always see the seeds we plant. But they grow, even if it takes time. Aaliyah glanced at Sophia, who stirred slightly in her sleep, her hand clutching the edge of her blanket. That's why I try, she said, for her, so that maybe, when she's my age, the world will be a little less heavy. Richard seemed to absorb her words, his brow furrowing slightly. My daughters, he said after a moment. They're adults now, and I like to think I raised them to see the world clearly. But hearing you talk, I realize there's more I could have done. More I still can do. It's never too late, Aaliyah said, her tone kind but firm. The fact that you're reflecting on it now means you're already taking steps forward. The young medical student, who had been quietly listening, leaned into the conversation. I think about that a lot, she said. How much of what we do is shaped by what we've seen, by the examples set for us. It's why people like you, Dr. Morgan, matter so much. Aaliyah met her gaze, her expression softening. And one day, it'll be you setting the example, she said, for your patients, for your colleagues, for the ones who come after you. The student smiled, her admiration evident. I hope so, she said. The flight attendant paused beside their row, a tray of drinks balanced on one hand. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke. I couldn't help but overhear, she said, her voice quiet but steady. What you're saying, it reminds me of something my mother used to tell me. She'd say, it's not enough to live in the world. You have to make it better for someone else. Aaliyah nodded, her eyes warm. Wise words, she said, and true. The attendant smiled, setting down a glass of water for Richard before moving on. The cabin seemed to hum with a quiet energy, as though the shared reflections had created an invisible thread connecting everyone who had been drawn into the conversation. For a while, no one spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was reflective. A shared pause to consider the weight of what had been said. Outside, the clouds stretched on, a reminder of the vastness of the world they inhabited and the small ways they could shape it. Richard broke the silence, his voice low. You've given me a lot to think about, Dr. Morgan, not just about what I've done, but about what I can still do. Aaliyah turned to him, her expression steady. Then that's where you start, she said simply, with what's in front of you. The plane hit a small patch of turbulence, jostling the cabin slightly. Sophia stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Mommy, she murmured, her voice drowsy. I'm here, baby, Aaliyah said, smoothing her daughter's curls. Everything's fine. Sophia nodded, leaning into her mother's side. The simple exchange seemed to anchor the moment, reminding everyone of the small, ordinary connections that carried so much meaning. As the plane continued its journey, the conversations faded into a comfortable quiet. Passengers returned to their books, their thoughts, their reflections, but something had shifted, subtle, unspoken, but undeniable. Aaliyah glanced out the window at the horizon, where the sky blurred into an endless stretch of blue. Change, she thought, wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes, it was as quiet as a conversation shared between strangers at 35,000 feet. But even the quietest moments had the power to ripple outward, reshaping the world one interaction at a time. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight edged closer to its destination. Passengers stirred in their seats, preparing for the slow transition from the suspended world of the sky to the reality of the ground below. Yet, within the quiet hum of the engines, a different kind of movement lingered, a collective awareness sparked by earlier conversations. Subtle but present in the way glances softened and interactions carried more thoughtfulness. Aaliyah remained seated, her posture composed but relaxed. Sophia, now fully awake, was chattering quietly about the shapes she saw in the clouds. Her stuffed giraffe, Mr. Spotty, tucked firmly under one arm. Aaliyah nodded along, her responses gentle but focused, letting her daughter's voice fill the space between them. The earlier tension had dissipated, leaving a quiet calm, but the weight of what had been shared still rested in the air. Across the aisle, Richard shifted in his seat, clearing his throat softly. He had been silent for a while, lost in thought, but now he leaned forward slightly. Addressing Aaliyah, "Dr. Morgan," he began, his voice steady but quieter than before. "I've been replaying our conversation in my mind. There's something I've been grappling with." Aaliyah turned toward him, her expression open and encouraging. "What is it?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I've spent my career advising companies on leadership, on how to foster inclusion, build trust, and create environments where people can thrive. But today, I realized how often I've approached those lessons from a distance. I've always thought of bias as something other people needed to work on. I never considered how my own assumptions might shape the way I lead." His words hung in the air, quiet but resolute. Aaliyah studied him for a moment, her gaze steady, acknowledging that as a step forward. She said, "Leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn and unlearn." Richard nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "It's humbling," he admitted, "to realize that even with the best intentions, you can still get it wrong. And yet, I feel like I've learned more from this flight than I have in years of seminars." Aaliyah offered a faint smile. "Sometimes the most meaningful lessons don't come from textbooks or training rooms," she said. "They come from moments like this, conversations that challenge us to see differently." The young medical student, seated a row behind, leaned forward slightly, her interest evident. "It's interesting," she said, her voice thoughtful. "In medicine, we're taught to rely on evidence, to analyze data, but when it comes to the biases we carry, it's not something you can measure in a chart. It's harder to recognize and harder to address." Aaliyah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's true," she said, "but it's also why it's so important. Bias isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes, it's as subtle as who we choose to listen to or who we don't." The student seemed to consider this, her gaze drifting toward the window. "Do you ever feel," she asked after a pause, "like you have to work twice as hard to prove yourself?" Aaliyah's smile was faint but knowing. "Every day," she said, "but I've learned to see it not as a burden, but as an opportunity. The more people see me in this role, the harder it becomes for them to deny what's possible." The woman seated ahead, who had spoken earlier about her granddaughter, turned again. "That's what's so powerful about stories like yours," she said. "They challenge the narratives people have carried for so long, sometimes without even realizing it." The conversation seemed to ripple outward once more. A man a few rows up spoke next, his voice steady but reflective. "It's easy to think of bias as someone else's issue," he said, "but the truth is, we all carry it, don't we? It's in the small things, how we treat a coworker, how we greet a stranger, even how we interpret silence." Richard nodded in agreement. "And if we're not careful," he said, "those small things add up. They become the foundation for something much larger and much harder to dismantle." Aaliyah glanced at Sophia, who was now quietly drawing shapes on her tablet. Her daughter's innocence was a reminder of what was at stake, not just for her, but for all the children who would inherit the world they were shaping. "It's why we have to start somewhere," she said, "even if it's just one conversation at a time." The flight attendant, passing by with a tray of water, paused to listen. Her expression was thoughtful as she spoke. "You know," she said, "I've worked on flights for over a decade, and I've seen moments like this before. But it's rare for people to actually talk about it, to face it head on. Usually, it just lingers, unspoken." Aaliyah nodded. "Silence can be comfortable," she said, "but it doesn't change anything. Talking about these things, it's uncomfortable. But it's necessary. The attendant offered a small smile. Well, I think this flight has been a step in the right direction, she said, before continuing down the aisle. The cabin settled again, the conversations fading into a reflective quiet. Aaliyah turned back to Richard, who was watching her with a thoughtful expression. Thank you, he said simply, not just for what you've shared, but for how you've shared it. With patience, with grace. It's a lesson I won't forget. Aaliyah met his gaze, her expression calm. Change doesn't happen all at once, she said, but every moment matters, even this one. As the plane began its descent, the sunlight streaming through the windows seemed warmer, softer. The conversations, though quieter now, carried a sense of purpose, a shared understanding that, while the journey was far from over, they had taken a step forward. Outside, the horizon blurred into the distance, a reminder of the vastness of the world below. Aaliyah glanced at Sophia, who was now looking out the window with wide-eyed wonder. In her daughter's gaze, she saw hope not just for the future, but for the possibility that, one day, these quiet lessons would lead to a world where such conversations were no longer needed. The plane began its gradual descent, the hum of the engines shifting as the cabin lights brightened slightly. Passengers stirred in their seats, stretching limbs stiff from the hours in the air, while flight attendants moved through the aisles, preparing for landing. The soft, familiar cadence of announcements filled the space. Yet there was a lingering quiet among those who had shared the earlier conversations, a quiet that carried the weight of reflection. Aaliyah helped Sophia adjust her seatbelt. The little girl's tired but content face brightened by the sunlight streaming through the window. The clouds had begun to break apart, revealing patches of land below. Are we almost there, Mommy? Sophia asked, her voice tinged with excitement. Almost, Aaliyah replied, smoothing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. Just a little longer. The moments of connection throughout the flight had left Aaliyah thoughtful, her mind turning over the unexpected depth of the exchanges. It wasn't the first time she had navigated assumptions or shared her story to shift someone's perspective. But this time had felt different. The honesty, the willingness to engage, it had created something more than just a fleeting conversation. It had planted seeds. Across the aisle, Richard caught her eye, his expression contemplative. He leaned forward slightly, speaking just loud enough for her to hear over the cabin noise. Dr. Morgan, I've been thinking about something you said earlier. About how every moment matters. Aaliyah turned to him, her expression calm but attentive. Yes? Richard paused, as though weighing his words. I think I've spent a lot of my life focusing on the big picture policies, strategies, systems. But I've realized something today. It's not just the big things that make a difference. It's these smaller moments, these conversations, that really change how we see each other. Aaliyah nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The big picture matters, she said, but it's built on moments like this, on the choices we make every day. He seemed to consider this, his brow furrowing slightly. I want to do better, he said finally, not just in my work, but in how I move through the world, how I teach my daughters, how I treat the people I meet. Today's reminded me that there's always room to grow. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Aaliyah met it with quiet encouragement. Growth is a process, she said, but the fact that you're reflecting on it now, that's a good place to start. Nearby, the young medical student who had joined their earlier conversation leaned in, her voice soft but determined. Dr. Morgan, I just wanted to thank you, she said. Hearing your story, it's reminded me why I chose this path in the first place. And it's shown me how much strength it takes to keep going. Aaliyah's smile widened slightly, her gaze steady on the student. You'll find that strength, she said, and one day, you'll be the one sharing your story, inspiring someone else. The student nodded, her expression thoughtful. I hope so, she said, because I want to be the kind of doctor who makes people feel seen like you do. The cabin grew quieter as the plane descended further, the land below coming into clearer focus. Aaliyah turned back to Sophia, who was now watching the landscape with wide eyes. Look, Mommy, I can see the trees, she exclaimed, her voice cutting through the reflective hush with a burst of innocent joy. Aaliyah chuckled softly, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. I see them too, she said. We'll be on the ground soon. As the plane touched down with a gentle jolt, the passengers seemed to exhale collectively, their movements slow and deliberate as they gathered their belongings. But the atmosphere felt different now, not the usual rush to disembark, but something quieter, more considerate. People exchanged nods and small smiles, their earlier conversations still fresh in their minds. Richard stood, retrieving his briefcase from the overhead compartment before turning back to Aaliyah. Dr. Morgan, he said, his tone quieter now, I hope you don't mind, but I'd like to stay in touch. I think your perspective could make a real difference in the work I do and in how I continue to learn. Aaliyah regarded him for a moment, then nodded. I wouldn't mind at all, she said. If sharing my experiences helps others see things differently, then it's worth it. Richard smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. Thank you, he said simply, for everything. Passengers began filing out of the cabin, their movements unhurried. The older woman who had spoken earlier about her granddaughter paused beside Aaliyah's seat, her hand resting lightly on the headrest. I just wanted to say, she said, her voice steady, what you've done today, it matters. It may not seem like much, but these moments ripple outward, and they stick with people. Aaliyah nodded, her gratitude evident. Thank you, she said. I hope they do. As Aaliyah and Sophia stepped into the terminal, the rush of everyday airport life enveloped them once more. But the quiet significance of the flight lingered in Aaliyah's mind, a reminder that even in the smallest spaces, change could begin. Sophia looked up at her, her face alight with anticipation. Are we going to see Grandma now? She asked. Yes, we are, Aaliyah said, taking her daughter's hand. Together, they walked toward the baggage claim, the sunlight streaming through the terminal windows casting a warm glow on their path. For a brief moment, Aaliyah allowed herself to imagine the world Sophia would grow up in, a world shaped by conversations like the ones they had shared today. A world where understanding grew, quietly but steadily, like roots spreading beneath the surface. And with each step forward, Aaliyah felt a quiet hope take root in her own heart.